Sarah's fingers bled in winter. The rough wool scraped her palms raw as she twisted thread in the dying light, working by touch more than sight. Outside her cottage window, the same fields her great-great-grandmother had known stretched endlessly toward a horizon that never changed. It was 1765, and time moved like honey. A coat took 3 months to make. A letter took 3 weeks to arrive. A journey from London to Edinburgh might kill you. This was simply how the world worked, how it had always worked, how, everyone assumed, it would always work. But 20 miles away, in a building she would never see, a man named Richard Arkwright was assembling a machine that would make Sarah's skill worthless. For 10 millennia, human civilization had operated within fixed boundaries. Power came from muscle, yours, your horses, or if you were lucky, from water falling or wind blowing in the right direction. A Roman merchant and an 18th century shopkeeper would recognize each other's world instantly. Same tools, same speeds, same fundamental limits. Then, in the span of a single human lifetime, everything shattered. This is the story of how we learned to crack open the Earth's ancient bones and burn them for power. How we taught metal to think and children to serve machines. How we built a new world so quickly we forgot to ask if we should. They call it the Industrial Revolution. But revolutions are violent, chaotic, irreversible things. And this one changed more than we intended. Britain in 1750 didn't look like a nation about to reshape reality. It looked like a very successful merchant empire sitting on a very large pile of rocks. But those rocks were coal, and that coal was everything. The British sat on more accessible coal deposits than any nation on Earth. While this seemed unremarkable at the time, just dirty black stone you burned for heat, it created a strange economic pressure. In Britain, it was expensive to hire a worker but cheap to buy energy. This imbalance would prove explosive. For other ingredients mixed into Britain's cauldron. First, they'd already revolutionized farming. New crop rotations, mechanical seed drills, and selective breeding meant fewer people could feed more mouths. Suddenly, tens of thousands of farm workers had nothing to do. They needed work. They needed it desperately. Second, Britain had something rare, predictable laws. You could own property, enforce contracts, form companies, take risks without fearing the king would simply seize your assets on a whim. Stability breeds investment. Investment breeds innovation. Third, geography blessed them. An island nation with deep harbors and navigable rivers. You could move goods cheaply. Mountains didn't trap regions in isolation. The sea connected rather than divided. Finally, the 17th century scientific revolution had created a culture obsessed with measurement, experimentation, and asking what if. Coffee houses buzzed with debate. Gentlemen scientists compared notes. Knowledge flowed. When these 5 elements combined, cheap energy, available labor, legal stability, easy transport, and scientific curiosity, they created conditions that had never existed before in human history. The fuse was lit. Britain just had to wait for the spark. The spark came from something unexpected: fashion. British elites had developed an obsession with Indian cotton. The fabrics arriving from Bengal were impossibly fine, brilliantly dyed, and far superior to anything Europe could produce. Indian weavers had perfected their craft over centuries. Their fingers moved with supernatural precision. They could thread a sari so delicate you could pull the entire garment through a wedding ring. Britain's wool and linen industries panicked. They lobbied Parliament, which responded by banning Indian cotton imports entirely. The Calico Acts tried to protect British textile workers from foreign competition. Instead, they accidentally created a challenge. If we can't import cotton cloth, we'll have to make it ourselves. Faster, cheaper, better. The race was on. In 1733, John Kay invented the flying shuttle, a simple device that let one weaver do the work of 2. Productivity doubled overnight. But this created an immediate crisis. Looms were now consuming thread faster than spinners could produce it. You needed 8 spinners to keep one weaver supplied. For 30 years, this bottleneck choked the industry. Then James Hargreaves, a weaver who probably never imagined his name in history books, created the spinning jenny. A single worker could now spin 8 threads simultaneously. Then 16. Then even more. The cottage industry suddenly had industrial capacity. Richard Arkwright saw the bigger picture. His water frame was too large for a cottage, too powerful for human hands to operate. It needed a river's force to run. So he built something new, the factory. Not a home where people worked, but a building whose only purpose was production. Samuel Crompton merged these innovations into the spinning mule, a machine that produced thread finer and stronger than any human could spin. The quality finally matched India's, but the volume was apocalyptic. In 1750, Britain imported 2.5 million pounds of raw cotton. By 1850, 588 million pounds. Manchester transformed from a modest market town into Cottonopolis, a sprawling mechanical organism of 900 factories. The sky turned permanently gray from coal smoke. The air vibrated with the clatter of machinery. At night, the city glowed with gaslight, humans working in shifts around the clock. Meanwhile, in Bengal, the weavers watched their orders disappear. Not because British cloth was better, it wasn't, but because machines made it cheaper. An entire industry, refined over generations, collapsed within decades. The hand weavers of India didn't lose to superior skill. They lost to superior volume. Millions found themselves without work, their expertise suddenly worthless. Britain had won by changing the rules of the game. While cotton mills spun the world's clothing, a darker transformation was happening in the Earth's depths. Coal mining had always been dangerous, brutal work. But as demand exploded, mines had to go deeper. And the deeper they went, the more water flooded in. Traditional pumps couldn't keep up. Mines drowned. Workers died. Production stalled. Then Thomas Newcomen built something that seemed like magic, a machine that could pump water using only fire and metal. His atmospheric engine was monstrous, inefficient, and absolutely revolutionary. It consumed coal at a staggering rate, but since it sat at the mouth of a coal mine, fuel was free. For the first time, human beings had created a tool that didn't tire, didn't need rest, didn't complain. It just worked, hour after hour, day after night, pumping thousands of gallons. But it was James Watt, a Scottish instrument maker, who saw what Newcomen had missed. The engine wasted enormous energy by cooling and reheating the same cylinder with every stroke. Watt added a separate condenser, and suddenly the engine used only 1/3 the coal. Then he made it rotational. Instead of just pumping up and down, it could turn a wheel. Power could now be transmitted to anything. This was the moment everything changed. A factory no longer needed to sit beside a river. It could be built anywhere you could deliver coal. Steam could blow bellows for blast furnaces, hammer iron, drive textile looms, power printing presses. The invisible workforce grew by thousands of horsepower every month. For 10,000 years, human civilization had been constrained by the energy you could extract from muscle, wind, or falling water. In the span of 40 years, we shattered that ceiling. We had discovered how to make slaves from fire. The age of steam needed a skeleton. That skeleton was iron. For centuries, iron production had been limited by a simple fact. Smelting required charcoal, which required trees. You could only produce as much iron as your forest could supply. But the Darby family discovered that coke, purified coal, could replace charcoal in blast furnaces. Suddenly, production exploded. The Iron Bridge, completed in 1779, announced to the world that something fundamental had shifted. A bridge made entirely of cast iron, spanning a river with impossible grace. People traveled from across Europe just to see it, to touch it, to believe it was real. New techniques like puddling and rolling made wrought iron affordable. Puddling was hellish work. Men stirred molten iron with long rods and furnaces, so hot your skin blistered from 5 feet away. Few puddlers lived past 40. Their lungs filled with smoke. Their bodies broke from the heat. But their labor built the bridges, the railways, the frameworks that would hold up the modern world. Iron became the default material for construction. Buildings grew taller. Bridges spanned wider. Machines grew stronger. The landscape itself was being rebuilt in metal. And with each new mill, each new furnace, each new factory, the demand for coal multiplied. In 1800, only 3% of humanity lived in cities. By 1900, that number approached 50%. This wasn't gradual change. This was a stampede. People flooded from the countryside, driven by enclosure laws that fenced off common lands they'd farmed for generations. They were pulled by promises of steady wages, by the hope that factory work meant security. What they found was something entirely different. Manchester's population exploded from 10,000 in 1717 to over 2 million by the early 20th century. But the city wasn't ready. There was no plan, no infrastructure, no housing. Families crammed into tenements with dirt floors and no windows. 20 people might share a single room. Sanitation didn't exist, waste piled in streets. Rivers turned colors never seen in nature as chemical plants dumped their refuse directly into waterways. Friedrich Engels walked through Manchester's poorest districts and described them as a stony desert. Children played in open sewers. The air smelled of death and industry in equal measure. Cholera swept through regularly. Typhoid was endemic. In some neighborhoods, more than half of all children died before age 5. Inside the factories, a new kind of discipline ruled. In rural life, work followed the sun and seasons. You worked hard during harvest, rested in winter. Humans set the pace. In the factory, the machine set the pace. Shifts ran 12 to 14 hours, 6 days a week. The clock became God. Lateness meant fines. Talking meant fines. Exhaustion was irrelevant. Most early textile workers were women and children. Not because factories were kind to them, but because they were cheaper. A child earned 10% of a man's wage. And children were small, perfect for crawling under moving machinery to collect loose cotton, for reaching into mechanisms to clear jams. They were called scavengers. 8-year-old fingers were nimble. 8-year-old bodies fit into tight spaces. 8-year-old minds were easier to control. The accidents were predictable. A moment's exhaustion, a distraction, a slip, and a child's hand disappeared into the gears. The machine didn't stop. Production schedules didn't allow for grief. Eventually, the horror became too visible to ignore. The Factory Acts began limiting child labor, requiring some schooling, gradually pulling children from the machinery. But it took decades, and thousands of small bodies. As factories multiplied, the old transportation system collapsed under the weight. Muddy roads turned impassable for half the year. River barges moved slowly. You couldn't scale an industrial economy on medieval infrastructure. First came the canals. The Bridgewater Canal demonstrated that moving coal by water was exponentially cheaper than by road. Coal prices in major cities dropped by half almost instantly. Canal mania followed. Investors raced to link industrial towns with ports. A single horse could pull a barge carrying 50 times what it could pull in a cart. Canals became the economic arteries of early industrialization. But canals were slow, and they froze in winter. The railway changed everything. George Stephenson's rocket, racing between Liverpool and Manchester in 1830, traveled at speeds humans had never experienced. 25 miles per hour felt like flying. Passengers vomited from motion sickness. Others wept from sheer exhilaration. For the first time in history, you could outrun a galloping horse. The railway shattered distance. You could have breakfast in Liverpool and dinner in Manchester. Information, goods, and people moved at speeds that seemed to violate natural law. Railways also created enormous demand for iron and coal, which created more factories, which required more railways. The feedback loop was dizzying. On the oceans, steam was doing the same. Sailing ships still dominated, but steamships didn't care about wind direction. You could predict arrival times with precision impossible in the age of sail. The world was shrinking. A merchant in London could track goods in Bombay with accuracy unimaginable a generation earlier. Britain tried desperately to contain its advantage. Laws forbade the export of machinery and the emigration of skilled workers. It was futile. Belgian industrialists lured British engineers with lavish salaries. French entrepreneurs memorized designs. American mechanics smuggled blueprints out in their memories. Belgium industrialized rapidly, its rich coal deposits in Wallonia transforming into a landscape of blast furnaces and textile mills that mirrored northern England. France's revolution was slower, more measured, less explosive, more evolutionary. But it came. Germany's story was different. Fragmented into dozens of small states, Germany had no unified market. But railways changed that, linking Berlin to the Ruhr Valley, creating demand for steel that sparked heavy industry. By unification, Germany was an industrial powerhouse, leading the world in chemical production. Across the Atlantic, America followed its own path. The American system of manufacturing pioneered interchangeable parts, machine-made components so precise they were identical. This enabled mass production on a scale that even Britain couldn't match. And in the East, Japan made a deliberate choice. After the Meiji Restoration, the government sent thousands of students abroad to learn Western technology. They built model factories, constructed railways, imported machinery. Within a generation, Japan transformed from feudal society to industrial power. The fire Britain had started was now consuming the world. Not everyone welcomed the machine. For skilled craftsmen, the Industrial Revolution was an apocalypse. Weavers who had spent years mastering their trade watched machines produce in one day what took them a week. Their expertise became worthless overnight. Desperation turned to rage. The Luddites began breaking into factories and smashing machinery with sledgehammers. They weren't ignorant. They understood exactly what the machines meant. The machines meant their children would starve. The government responded with overwhelming force. Machine breaking became a capital offense. Soldiers guarded factories. The message was clear. The old world would not be allowed to resist. In the countryside, agricultural workers destroyed threshing machines in the swing riots. These were the death screams of a way of life that had existed for thousands of years. But from this chaos, something new emerged: organization. Workers realized that while one man was powerless against a factory owner, 1,000 men could halt production entirely. Trade unions formed, initially illegal, gradually gaining the right to strike. Slowly, painfully, workers forced improvements. Shorter hours, better pay, safer conditions. The factory system didn't moderate itself, it was forced to moderate. In the realm of ideas, the revolution sparked philosophical warfare. Karl Marx witnessed Manchester's factories and saw a system of exploitation that would inevitably destroy itself. He predicted workers would rise up and seize the means of production. The Romantics, poets like Blake and Wordsworth, recoiled in horror at the dark satanic mills. They mourned nature's destruction and the loss of human dignity. Even the environment began pushing back. Pollution became so severe that laws were passed regulating industrial emissions. Scientists traced cholera outbreaks to contaminated water, leading to massive public works projects building sewage systems. The revolution was learning limits. By the mid-19th century, the first industrial revolution had matured, but a second wave was building. The Bessemer process allowed mass production of steel, stronger, more flexible than iron. Skyscrapers became possible. Giant bridges spanned rivers that had been barriers for millennia. Petroleum began replacing coal. The internal combustion engine was born. Henry Ford would soon perfect the assembly line, making cars affordable for ordinary people. Electricity arrived like magic. Gas lighting, which had extended the workday into night, was replaced by electric grids. Cities became permanently illuminated. The rhythm of human life shifted from daily cycles to constant operation. The telegraph connected continents in minutes. A message that would have taken months by ship now traveled at the speed of lightning through copper wires. Department stores emerged, offering dizzying arrays of consumer goods. Shopping became entertainment. Mass consumption was born. The world was now fully, irrevocably modern. You're reading this on a device that would seem like sorcery to Sarah, the woman spinning wool in the dark in 1765. You likely read it while riding in a machine that moves faster than any horse, or while sitting in a climate-controlled room lit by invisible electricity. You can communicate instantly with someone on the other side of the planet. You can fly through the air. You can access humanity's accumulated knowledge with a few keystrokes. You are the unimaginable future those first factory workers couldn't dream of. But you're also asking the same question they asked. What do we give up for this? The Industrial Revolution lifted millions from grinding poverty. It extended lifespans, reduced hunger, created opportunities that never existed before. It freed humanity from the tyranny of muscle power and seasonal limits. But it also created unprecedented inequality. It destroyed ecosystems. It turned children into machine parts. It replaced community with efficiency, craftsmanship with volume, and patience with speed. We gained the world and lost something we're still trying to name.